What's up you guys, my name is Mark and welcome to my channel. Today I'm going to be going over how I made this 3D printed Wolverine cowl and finished it without using any paint or primer. Let's go. I purchased and downloaded these files off the DO3D website. I will have a link in the description below. I sliced these files in Cura and printed them on my Ender 5 Plus. I wanted to make this cowl without using any primer or painting in post-processing. So, I used matte black PLA filament for the eyepieces and used silk yellow PLA filament for the main helmet. Silk PLA prints a bit different than regular PLA, so it took a few tries to get the helmet to print, and I ended up using way more supports than I usually do, but what are you gonna do? After the parts were printed, I removed the supports, which honestly took a while. I also printed inner eyepieces and will print out some mesh inserts using white PLA later in the build. I did a quick fitment check to make sure that everything fit together, and then it was time to start sanding. I started out sanding using 220 grit sandpaper. I found over time that it's best to stick with trusted brands such as 3M when it comes to sandpaper, otherwise you end up going through way more than what's actually needed. After about 10 minutes of hand sanding, I got sick of it and decided to switch to a palm sander because I'm lazy and impatient. Using a palm sander really speeds up the process. You just have to be careful not to keep the sander in one spot for too long, because if you do, the friction from the sander will begin to melt the pieces. After palm sanding, I lightly hand sanded each piece again, and this was the result. The main helmet piece already looks really good, and you can hardly see any layer lines because of the texture. The sanding marks and layer lines on the eyepieces are still pretty prominent, but we will see them less and less as we increase the grit size of the sandpaper over time. Next, I moved on to 2000 grit sandpaper. Now, I realize that this is a massive jump, but I wanted to see how many grit sizes I could skip without sacrificing the quality of the surface finish. I sprayed water and dish soap on the pieces and wet sanded them. The reason I wet sand is because when you get to a fine grit like this, dust can build up very quickly and clog your sandpaper. I found that using water and soap keeps the dust from collecting and sticking to the sandpaper. After a short time sanding, you can already see the surface improvements of the part. After sanding all the pieces with 2000 grit sandpaper, I bumped it up to 3000 grit. I wet sanded all the pieces in the same way I sanded them with the 2000 grit sandpaper. One of my big goals for this project was to finish these parts without using paint or primer, so instead of painting at this point, I decided to polish the parts. I created a rotary attachment for my Dremel Infusion 360 and printed it off on my 3D printer. I cut a small piece of Velcro and attached it to the end of my tool. I bought a coarse polishing disc and cut a small circular piece out of it and attached it to the end of my rotary tool. I applied some coarse polishing compound and distributed it across the part's surface. I then used my rotary tool to work the compound into the PLA. After most of the compound was absorbed, I wiped the remaining residue off with a microfiber towel. As you can clearly see, buffing the piece gives a shinier and finished look. After polishing with the coarse compound, I washed all the pieces with soapy water and applied a few layers of Rust-Oleum's clear coat. The clear coat helps even out any remaining micro scratches and also enhances the glossiness of all the parts. I want to note at this point that I'm not trying to make all these parts look exactly perfect. There are going to be a few micro scratches and imperfections in the mask when it's complete, but for me, it's not the end of the world. If you do want near perfect parts, you can repeat the prior steps as many times as you want until you get the finish that you desire. After the clear coat is applied, I used a fine polishing compound and fine buffing pad to finish the pieces off. I once again used the Dremel and my homemade rotary attachment to apply the compound. This makes the parts even shinier and gives them a really nice final finish. At this point, I've got a really nice surface finish on the parts and I can start to assemble the mask. This model actually has built-in holes for 1/8 inch magnets. I got these magnets off of Amazon and will have a link in the description below so you can purchase them too. I installed the magnets on both sides of the mask using super glue. Now, this can be a bit tricky and sometimes you can end up gluing the magnets together, so be careful. After installed, it makes the cowl super easy to take on and off. The last step is assembling the eyes. I used a 3D printer pen to solder the eye inserts to the back of the larger eye pieces. I then used super glue to attach the small white mesh pieces to the eye inserts. And after that, the build was pretty much done. I'm really happy with how this cowl turned out, and I'm especially pleased that I got the surface finish that I wanted without using any paint or primer. Now that I've made a cowl, I might also have to 3D print some metal Wolverine claws. But that's to come in the future. Anyway, here's the end result. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like and consider subscribing to my channel for more content. It really helps me out and I really appreciate it. So thank you and stay classy.